This week we celebrated All Saints Sunday, remembering those who we lost to death in the last year, celebrating those in our past that have touched our lives with the love of God. We have a white rose ceremony on that day and use the roses to remember our loved ones. So we celebrate with the white roses today as well. The text is part of a story that John writes for the people who lived in the time of John's revelation. The people struggled, they were afraid, they lost many to death at the hands of the empire who ruled them. Their everyday life was a struggle. They needed a path and an understanding of the world that brought them some kind of hope and belonging. So listen for the living word of the Lord from the 21st chapter of the Revelation of John. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. And I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "See, the home of God is among mortals. God will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. God will wipe every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more, for the first things have passed away." And the one who was seated on the throne said, "See, I am making all things new." Also, he said, "Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true." Then he said to me, "It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." Holy words, holy wisdom. Thanks be to God. In 2007, philosopher Charles Taylor traced a long arc of historical development in Western societies that reflected a shift from the God-centered cosmos in the pre-modern era to one focused today on the human self in isolation, centered on its own ends. Today, as a postmodern people, we are expected, even encouraged, to write our own stories rather than recognizing a powerful story that gives meaning to our lives and then finding our place in its interconnectedness. And perhaps, along with others in that story, rewriting its weaknesses. The most common stories that we are offered today are individual consumer stories. We can buy and consume our way to happiness. Technology can solve all our problems, and positive thinking will overcome adversity. And while those are nice, compelling, seemingly workable self-help thoughts, they are truly found to be profoundly inadequate in the face of human suffering, brokenness, oppression, and death. We are no longer connected as we used to be. My kids live in the four corners of the universe: Buffalo, North Carolina, Maine, and Tulsa, Oklahoma. We rewrite our stories and our values and our goals based on the year or the day or perhaps the group with which we're associated at the time. One seminary professor and researcher says, quote, "With no fixed anchors of identity and belonging, we have little security. Without a deep inherent security, we find ourselves having to ignore or deny the significant questions of death, meaning, and purpose because we don't have the foundation that gives us the strength to struggle with those difficult questions." Starting with a story grounded in me, myself, and I literally prevents us from forming authentic connections, community, or a meaningful purpose for our lives. In this postmodern culture that surrounds and shapes us in spite of ourselves, we are gathered into a faith community. And that faith community invites us to hear and connect to God's story for us. It's a story of good creation. It's the story of an unbreakable covenantal connection. It's the story of a purpose, an offered purpose, to live out of the love we've received in order to love the world to perfection. My mom is on my mind these days. We lost her recently at age 91. But she's also the best example that I have of living the stories of this faith and showing me that I had a place, a unique and valued place in God's story. My childhood church had a bus ministry, very popular in the 70s. We rode the church bus into the poor neighborhoods in town and offered the kids all kinds of snacks, which gathered them together and invited them to ride on the bus the next day with the promise of more snacks. At one house, my mom learned that their mom was really sick. We went home. My mom made a huge pot of soup and we headed back to the house, which really couldn't be called a house. It was more of a shack. Kids were everywhere outside. I think there were 12 in that family. We entered a tiny, dark, filthy living room with tattered furniture. The mom stood in the bedroom doorway, her eyes cast to the floor, and said a quiet thank you as my mom sailed through the house, greeting the family like she was greeting the most prominent family in our little town. I turned on the kitchen light, and cockroaches, seemingly by the millions, scattered in every direction. My mom hated cockroaches. The sight of one in our house meant an immediate cleaning blitz that let nobody off the hook. So I watched with very wide eyes to see what she would do. My mother did not bat an eye. She set her pot on the stove. She told the mom that she would pick it up the next Saturday when the bus came around. She spoke to all the kids. She smiled, she chatted, and wished the mother a quick recovery as we left. On the way home, she said, Jesus touched the lepers. He ate breakfast with the Gerasene demoniac. He taught us that if we feed the hungry, it's like feeding a hungry Jesus. She reminded me in word and action and story that we receive God's love in spite of the cockroaches of our lives, and we are called to love others in the same way. And she went back to that shack the next week and picked up her pot. In every part of my life, my mom connected what we did to God's story of love and community that's revealed in the biblical witness. In every decision she made, she held the rule of love God and love neighbor as her highest value. When my sister came out as gay her sophomore year in college, my mother struggled with the story she had received from her church about that issue. But we sat together at the dining room table and she told me that she had prayed for days and that the only thing she could see that Jesus would do is accept and value who my sister was as a part of God's good creation. These were the stories that shaped my life. The church, never being perfect, offered me some stories interpreted as justification to exclude some people, to judge some, and to limit the participation of some. But as I began to read those stories for myself and was introduced to scholars who interpreted them very differently from the church of my childhood, became unquestioned in my mind that the greatest commandment of love that Jesus taught was the foundation of God's work and our call. Not all churches are the same. So I found one that told and lived the story of being loved and loving into perfection. My mom lived that foundation. Her parents before her, their parents before them, and now it's my turn. It's my turn to share the story with my kids and with the people in this faith community, and hopefully through all of our living and telling, we'll share it with more of the world. In some way, all those we remember today shared some reflection of God's love, which is God's story. Our service of Witness to the Resurrection, our funeral service in the PCUSA, has a beautiful prayer which says, loving God, we thank you for your child and servant, recalling in them all that inspired love. Thanks be to the God who writes a story for us in which what is preserved forever in all of us is that inspires love. Thanks be to the God who seats Jesus the Christ on the throne, the Christ who judges the world with the deepest, most profound love. Thanks be to our God who ends the story with a new heaven and a new earth, with the home of God being among us, with no more tears or death, no more mourning and crying and pain. And our great hope in joy and in grief is the trustworthy and true word, "It is done." I am the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. The end of our story is written, waiting for us to arrive. Everything and everyone will be loved into perfection. Thanks be to God. Amen.